September 22nd, 1987. This is Joe Todd, an interview with Mrs. Bernice Jackson in Woodward, Oklahoma. Miss Jackson, where were you born?
I was born in the southeastern corner of Beaver County, Oklahoma, which is the panhandle of Oklahoma. And the post office at that time was Venus, Oklahoma. Family was living in a two-story house and about a mile from my parents' dugout. And the mail would come once a week. And so once a week my father would make a trip over to Venus. This family lived in the upper story of the house and a little store in the bottom part along with this post office.
Where did the name Venus come from?
I really don't know, and I don't know who named it.
When's your birthday?
April the 25th, 1908.
And who's your father?
Landom Lloyd, Landom. But nobody knew him by that name. That was a big name to give a baby anyway. And so his uncles began to calling him Dick, and he was commonly known as Dick Lloyd from then on.
And your mother's name?
Clara Marie Childress.
Childress.
Yes.
And where are your parents from?
My father was born in Illinois, close to Pittsfield, and his parents moved to Lynn County, Missouri, shortly after he was born. And my grandfather, or his father, bought 40 acres of land, and that wasn't big enough farm after the boys all got big enough, so the boys had to scatter out and do for themselves. And I might say that my father was a premature baby, and in those days they didn't know what to do with preemies. But my great-grandmother fixed a shoebox, and lined it, and they had a wood-burning stove. She kept the oven door down all the time, and that's where he lived for the first 3 months of his life. And he never cried until he was 3 months old. And my great-grandmother, I don't know what all she fed him, but every 2 hours he got a feeding, and he just weighed 3 pounds. He cried when he was 3 months old, and my great-grandmother said that was when he should have been born. But he grew, and he got to weighing over 200 pounds, so being a little baby didn't seem to faze him any.
And where was your mother from?
My mother was born in Colorado. Her parents made the trip in their honeymoon. Was a trip to Trinidad, Colorado in a wagon train. Now their train left Missouri, Laclede, Missouri, on Friday after they were married, I think Monday or Tuesday. Anyway, there was several wagons in this train, and out in Kansas they were supposed to connect with another wagon train on account of the Indians, And their captain got sick. And by the time that this other train caught up with him, he wasn't able to travel. He just couldn't go. And the captain of the other train wanted to go on. But and the captain that was sick left it up to the individuals if they wanted to go on with this other train to go on and just leave him. But everyone in that train stayed with their captain until they got well. Now, when I was 11 years old, I was with my grandmother Childers for about a month. And I love to hear those stories about what happened on this wagon train. But I only remember one. They hadn't had any green vegetables to eat for a long, long time. And out in Kansas, they came up on a patch of cabbage. A farmer had a huge cabbage patch. They stopped and they tried to buy some cabbage, and the farmer wouldn't sell them any. And so they had to go over a little raise. And when they got down on the other side of this raise, hilly place, they were outside of the house. The women climbed out of the wagon with their butcher knives, and they began gathering cabbage, heads of cabbage. And that night they had a great big kettle stew of fresh cabbage, and how much they enjoyed that, the fresh vegetable.
What year was that?
I knew you would ask me that, and let's see, I can figure back a little. My mother was born in 1879, and she was the fifth child. Most of their children were born in Colorado. Then count back about 10 years, be 69. I imagine it was somewhere. I know it was after the Civil War was over because my grandfather Childers served in the Civil War. So it'd be about, 1866 perhaps.
Have any stories about the Civil War?
No, not that I heard. He probably had them and could tell them. He was injured in the Civil War. But as far as I can tell, I never did see my grandfather Childers. He died when I was 11 years old, and I never, my mother and I went back for his services, but I never got to visit with him or know him, really. Then to get back to this trip, my grandparents going out to Colorado, the train that came in from, I think from Nebraska, that was to meet them in western Kansas, they went on. And the train that my grandparents were in stayed until their captain got well. And then they started on, and they met the soldiers coming to meet them. And they came up on the wreckage of this train that had gone on ahead. The Indians had killed everyone except one woman and her 2 children. And they took them captive. And the chief made her his squaw. And she had 2 children by this Indian. And I don't know how my grandmother was telling me these stories when I was 11, I was almost 12. And if she told me how they found out that this white woman was in with these Indians, I have forgotten. Anyway, this woman's father had heard that there was a white woman with this tribe of Indians. And so he took a bunch with him, and they went to this tribe. And she recognized her father immediately, and he recognized her. And they had mistreated her. The Indian women were jealous of her. And this chief had several wives, And Evidently, from the story that my grandmother told me, this chief had just one tent. His was big and enormous and better than the rest of them. And he and his wives all slept in this one tent. And when the slaves or the Indians would be gone on a hunt or something, his other wives was really mean to her. And they killed her 2 boys. They tortured them to death. And they wouldn't let, these little boys would be tortured and they'd walk their mother, you know, or they wouldn't let them go to their mother. And so when her father asked her if she wanted her Indian children, she said no. She didn't want them. She had 2 children by this chief. And so the chief let her go. And she went back to her father.
Now, was that in Kansas?
That was, well, somewhere in western Kansas or Colorado, somewhere in there. See, I was really listening to my grandmother, and I loved those stories. But now it's difficult to remember all these little things.
And when did your parents move to Oklahoma?
Well, you see, my father was born in Illinois, his mother in Colorado. Both families moved back to Lynn County. And my Lynn County.
Where's it?
It's in central northern part of Missouri. Laclede was their town, and the county seat was Linneus at that time. Town about 4 miles north of Laclede. And my father grew up there, and my mother lived in Laclede. My grandfather made axe handles for a living, and he shipped them all over the United States. And he used nothing but hickory wood. And he would go out in the trees, you know, it's heavily forested in Missouri is, and he would pick out his trees and he would buy them, pay for them. And in the winter months, he would cut those trees down and haul them into town. And he had the machinery to cut them up and make axe handles. And he had his own labels to put on these axe handles. And people came for miles to get his axe handles because they wouldn't break that hickory wood, you know.
What label did he have on that?
Made by Elisha Childress. Well, he had another word on it, but I forgot. And my father and mother got acquainted. I never could get them to tell me just how they got acquainted. I know that my mother wasn't allowed to go to dances, and my father loved to dance. So it wasn't at a dance, but I just never could get either one of them to tell me just how they met. But anyway, they were married March the 18th, 1897. They were married March the 18th, 1897. My oldest brother was born March the 20th, 1898. My next brother was born in 1900, and my sister was born in 1902. And then I was born in 1908. However, we had a brother that was born in 1904 but he didn't live only about 3 months. And then my youngest sister was born in 1913. And that completed the family. And they rented in Missouri a long time, well, until 1901. And Daddy decided, and Mother too, that that's all they would ever be, would be renters, because, see, that country had been settled up a long time. People owned the land, and a young man couldn't possibly get a piece of land of his own. And so my father, he laughed, told different times about, he gave Mother her choice. Either go to Chillicothe, he could get to be, he could work on the railroad there, but he would be gone every other night. Or they could go to Oklahoma and starve. And she said, well, let's go to Oklahoma and starve. So in the fall of 1900, my grandfather decided 40 acres of land wasn't enough if he could get 160, by filing on it in Oklahoma. So he came, and one of Daddy's brothers, and they came in covered wagons. They had 2 covered wagons, and they had 6 horses. My father's covered wagon, I don't know how he managed it, but he had a little topsy stove. That was, you know what a little topsy stove is?
Describe it.
Well, it stood about 2 feet high, I think, with 2 lids on it. And he put a double floor in his wagon. He fastened this stove down. But I still haven't figured out how he run the stovepipe out through these canvas and not set the canvas on fire, his overjet. But my father was very handy in everything. He could always figure out something. He figured out something. I don't know just what. And the men would sleep, the 3 men, one of them would walk. They'd take turns walking. And they had 2 horses that that followed along behind the wagons. And they would pick up sticks and things and throw them in the other wagon. The other wagon now carried the horse feed and their stuff that they would burn in this topsy stove. They didn't have any way of heating that wagon. And then when night would come, they would all 3 sleep they would cook in Daddy's wagon, and then they would sleep in there, And I don't think there was anything exciting happen because the country was settled up, and they could stop at the towns they'd come through. They could stop at the farmhouses and buy feed for the horses. And I think it was uneventful until they got just a few miles from Woodward. And it was in March, and it was a blizzard on. And they were just about ready to, it was terrible, and great big drifts, And they were just about ready to stop, and they saw a wagon ahead of them. And so they urged the horses on, and they caught up with this wagon. And it was a man, his wife, and baby, and his horses was just completely fagged out. They couldn't go no longer. And he was stuck in this big snowdrift. And so they all stayed right there, and it was Mr. and Mrs. Haight. They were headed for Oklahoma to get some of the free land. And so Mrs. Haight got over, they all got in Daddy's wagon, and they built a fire. She was wrapped up in all the quilts that they had to keep her and the baby warm, and Mr. Haight was about froze because he was standing out there trying to urge his horses to go on. Well, I don't know how many days they spent there, but I remember Daddy saying it was sure good to eat somebody else's cooking. And Mrs. Haight then rode in Daddy's wagon when they did get started on into Woodward. When they did arrive in Woodward, they took care of the horses. Then they went up to the public land office. And they had a huge map on the wall showing what quarter sections had been taken and which hadn't. And these quarter sections out in Beaver County, see, that was that panhandle at that time was known as Beaver County. See, from 1890 to 1907, that whole strip was known as Beaver County. But they had to come to Woodward to take care of their business in this public land office. So they picked out 3, my father and grandfather and uncle. And Daddy chose the one close to a creek because he wanted to be close to water. And they left one wagon here in Woodward and they went out and they looked the land over, and it took them 2 days to even get to this place. And when they got there, they found a rancher by the name of Whitworth. He was laying claim to this land, but he didn't have any right to it, of course. He was just a squatter, you might say. And so he tried to discourage my father from taking this. He said he had seen it go as much as 3 years with just little tiny showers now and then, and grass would dry up, it wasn't a farming country, and but he says, I can't stop you folks. If you want to go ahead and file in my pasture here, he says, I can't stop you. And so Daddy went on, and the next day, and they were real nice to him. They took care of him overnight. And Daddy fixed his, whatever sign he had to have that he wanted this another family had moved in and took a 40-acre out of this 160 acres there. They had come from, some country or some state in the east, and 40 acres was a big farm there. So they thought 40 acres would be enough here. So they just piled on 40 acres. Well, Daddy took the rest of the 120 acres, see, in that quarter. Then he took 40 acres across the section line in another section. That made his 160 acres. And then they hurried back to Woodward and piled on those 3. And my grandfather, my uncle was his 160 was in the same section that Daddy's 40 acres was. Then my grandfather filed on 160 acres in the next section west there. Well, they hurried back and they signed up, and then they hurried back out and they started a dugout. And they finished the dugout. I can't tell you the dimensions of it. And just as quick as they got the dugout finished, why, they lived in the covered wagons, see, while they were working that way. Then they had to plow so many acres, 8 or 10 acres, and start a crop. And then he sent for my mother, and she came out on a train with 2 little boys. And I can just imagine how my mother felt leaving Missouri and coming out on that country without any trees to a dugout. It'd be quite a change. But she was brave, and she was the one that said, let's go to Oklahoma and starve, so she didn't complain. Well, that fall, when my mother came out, my grandfather would come over at night and sleep in the covered wagon. And because my daddy and Uncle Henry had gone to Kansas with their horses and wagons to work in the harvest field. And they were gone about 3 months. And they stayed till, well, they stayed till late in the fall because they needed the money, you know. And in the meantime, my grandfather would eat his breakfast with Mother, and then he'd walk over to his claim and he would work around there. He was building a sod house. He knew what kind of work he could do. Then my father planted a lot of trees down in that corner, and he managed to dig a well, hand dug a well, and it was a pretty neat little setup for pioneers when they got it going.
How deep was the well?
I think it was about 20, 25 feet. It wasn't so deep. But at that time, you see, that was before the drought. The water level was up pretty high. And I want to tell you this story. By that time, my sister, Frances, was born. And you know, the women, they lived maybe half mile apart, something like that. There was a settler by that time on every quarter section. So one afternoon, my mother decided she'd walk over and visit Grandma Nyhart. She hadn't seen another woman for weeks, and she was getting kind of homesick. So she took the two little boys, and Frances was a baby, and she walks over to Grandma Nyhart's. Well, she starts home, and she gets about halfway home, and all at once she finds herself surrounded with those longhorn cattle that had moved in. Well, she was scared to death. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know whether to turn around and go back, and there was cattle behind her and cattle in front of her. But she'd always heard them say that if you'd stay away from the mothers and their calves, that they wouldn't bother you. Well, she instructed the little boys to hang on to her skirt tails, one on each side, and not turn loose, don't say a word, don't call out. And she says, we'll just walk real slowly and maybe we'll make it. Well, she said it seemed like it was never going to get to her house, you know. And when she got to her house, why, Daddy had a 2-wire, smooth wire fence up, and they had a little garden there. And she said she just fell over in that garden. Of course, it wouldn't have protected her if cow brute wanted her. But she said she felt so safe. And then from there, she got into the dugout. But that is part of being a pioneer.
Do you remember how the dugout was furnished?
No, I don't even remember seeing the dugout. It was filled in time I can remember. But I remember them talking about they lived with this little topsy stove. That's what my mother cooked on. And I just couldn't tell you how it's furnished. Now, when the 4th child was born, Daddy was saving up money to build a house. And he and the other Lloyd men got busy and built a sod house right in front of the dugout. And it was just a one-room sod house, and I couldn't tell you how big a room it was. I remember them talking about it had one window in it and a door, and that was the only openings in it. But that's a room that I was born in. And my mother was so in hopes they would get the new house done before the baby come, you know. And they didn't get it done. So I'm proud to say I was born in a sod house.
Where did you start school?
I started school at the Lovell School. The first school was just across the road from my grandfather's house. And they called that school Venus. Because the Venus Post Office, you know, a little store, and that was the closest store to the folks. And whenever they needed a sack of flour or some salt or something, that's where they would go. But that house was also a sod house, and my oldest brother went to school in that school. Then, as the settlers moved in, there were more children to go to school. They had more children than they could seat in that little house. So they decided to build a frame house, the community did. Well, where to set it? Well, they wanted to set. So they wanted to build it on Mr. Lovell's place, but he objected because he said that his fences would always be down and the kids are climbing in and over the fences. And he objected. So my uncle, who wasn't married and who didn't have any children, of course, was generous enough to donate an acre of ground in the corner of his pasture. And they built the schoolhouse on his land. And all right, what are we going to call that school? It had to be called Lovell School, because Mr. Lovell's house was just a little bit closer to the school building than what my grandfather's was, even though the school was built on the Lloyd land. And so I went to school and I never will forget my first school teacher.
Who was that?
Elsie Davis. They needed school teachers in there, and I don't know how they got the word back to Illinois and Indiana and Ohio, but there were several young women came out from those states to teach the little heathens out there. And Elsie Davis was my first teacher, and I went to school to her 2 years, and Jenny Martin was my next teacher. She taught there 3 years and married my uncle. And my next teacher was Mrs. Overstreet. They were having problems getting a teacher for the Lovell School. And she was about, I imagine she must have been in her 60s, but to me, I thought she was terribly old. And being left-handed, the other school teachers never did try to teach me to write. And I wrote a terrible hand. You couldn't read it hardly. I couldn't read it either. But this Mrs. Overstreet, she sat down in front of me and put her right hand, see, on my left side, and she would teach me how to hold my pencil. And we had those ovals and straight lines, and she taught me this muscular system. And believe it or not, I won a contest in my writing when I went to school in Hutchinson, Kansas. And when they found out I was left-handed, they didn't know whether they was going to give me the award or not.
Why is this prejudice against left-handed people? What's the reason?
They're overcoming that now. They can see that it's nature, laws of nature, that some of us is left-handed and some right, I guess. But the main important thing is not to try to change it.
But why was the prejudice against the left-handed people? Is there any basis for that? Or?
I don't know, unless if you'll stop to think everything that is made to be used in your right hand.
Were your schools one-room schoolhouse?
Yes.
Would you explain how that one teacher handles all the different grades in one room?
I can remember each teacher had a different system, and they were all good. They were all just real good. When I got up in the 3rd and 4th grades, she would assign us our seats, and then she had a schedule made out. She would have, say, physiology and geography every other day. They had to do that because, to get all of it in a week's time, you see, and keep up with what the state required. And we did all of our studying at school. We very seldom had any homework to take home. At that time, they considered that if you used your study periods at school, there was no need of taking homework. And the teachers saw that we used those study periods. However, they didn't know that I sat there and listened to the rest of the classes recite. That's all right. I learned a lot. Mm-hmm. And now, see, this is where the children is seated. Up here, up in front of here, there would be a long recitation seat. And say she was calling the 7th grade up. Well, we would all go to one side of the room and go up to this recitation seat while the class that she had excused came down on this side of the building to their seat. That saved a little time. And we'd take our seats, and then her desk would be up here, see. And so that's the way they managed to get in all of the classes. We had 2 big blackboards, and maybe she would have an arithmetic class up at the blackboard working problems at the same time as she would be reciting maybe a history class. They knew how to plan their time, and sometimes I think it would be better if our schools today would have, say, 2 or 3 classes in one room, because just like Laura Hoke, who went to a one-room school and also taught a one-room school, said that she learned a lot by listening to the upper grades. And she said that was advancing for her. Well, I did the same thing. And it didn't take me long to get my spelling lesson, and I'd hurry and study my spelling so I could listen in. Or I'd hurry and get the class that was coming next. I'd read it over, and I don't remember whether they used phonics or not. However, nearly every child in that school were good readers. Now, I don't remember the system that the teacher used, but several of the county superintendent complimented our school on having such good readers. But what system they use, I don't remember. I know when I taught school, I used the phonics system. And I had good readers in my school. When I graduated from the 8th grade, I went to Follett for 1 year, and freshman year, and then my mother became ill, and she was doctoring with the doctor at Beaver. And so my father went up there and bought a house and lot and moved my mother and us girls up there. And I finished my high school at Beaver.
And what year did you graduate?
27.
1927. During World War I, did you have any organized effort to support the war work?
Oh, yes. I remember distinctly everybody in the community in that district met at the school to buy bonds. And we had a German family live there, and they were the only family that didn't show for this meeting. We had a couple of hotheads among the men. They were ready to just go over and tar and feather them, you know, and they was ready to do a lot of bad things to them. And my father said, well, I think that we should go and talk to them first and see why they're here. Said it might be that they don't understand. The old parents, the older people, didn't speak English, but they had 2 sons that did speak English. Well, my father having opened his mouth, which he always got into problems like that, they voted on him to go over and talk to him. Well, one of the hotheads went with my father, and Daddy said he didn't know what was going to happen. But he asked this man to please let him do the talking, since they had voted to send him as a speaker to please let him do the talking. Well, they'd talk to the boys, and the boys then would talk to the parents. And just as quickly as that family understood what it was about, they turned over more money than anybody else in the community, in the district. Even these 2 men, they gave more money than they did. Well, that shut them up mighty quick. And we had meatless days and wheatless days, and going to school to making sandwiches, it was terrible. We had to take cornbread, and none of us children liked cornbread. But we didn't complain, and but one day at noon, I'll call him a neighbor. Mother had the table just ready for us to sit down to eat, and that man didn't knock. He opened the door and he walked in, and he looked the table over and he says, well, I see you've got cornbread. And Mother says, yes, we're eating cornbread today. What are you and your family eating? Oh, cornbread, of course. And he visited just a minute, and out the door he went. And the folks always thought that he was being paid to spy on the neighbors, to see, because you were punished, you know. I don't remember the punishment, but you were punished if you didn't follow instructions.
Flu epidemic.
Flu epidemic. Yes, I'll never forget that. I was the first one to take the flu in the family, of course. They talked about closing the school because it was an epidemic, all right. But the patrons got together and they decided that if they didn't leave the country, if they didn't go on long trips or anything, then they could continue the school. So they decided to do that. But we had one family that came down to Gage, which was about 35 miles, and spent the weekend with her parents, and they all had the flu. So that family brought the flu back to our area. And they didn't say a word about being gone or anything. And the children got sick in school, and I sat with one of the girls, and she was sick and running high fever. So of course I took it. And they talk about having flu now, you know, with a 24-hour flu or something like that. That isn't what we had at all. It lasted fully a week or 10 days, and you were sick, you run a high fever, and you'd move and it'd just feel like your bones was just going to break. And my father, about a month before that, was in Follett, and he asked Dr. Martley, he says, if my family gets the flu, what is the best home remedy that I can have for them? And you know what he said? Epsom salts. Oh, I'll tell you, my father came home with a great big package of Epsom salts. Every time any of us would ask for a drink of water, there was a little bit of Epsom salt in that water. And my older sister and I, we got to where we weren't thirsty. But we were fortunate. The whole family had the flu except my father and my second brother. And why they didn't take it, I don't know. But it was cold, snow on the ground, about a foot deep. We just had a big blizzard. And my father would, and my brother would get up and get breakfast or whatever eats we would eat, which we didn't eat very much. And then he'd start north to a neighbor's. Then he'd go west to another neighbor's. And then he'd go south a mile to where my grandparents lived. And my brother would go south down to the Neihart place, take care of them, maybe cook eggs and fry eggs and take care of them. Then he'd go west and take care of the Lovell family. Then he'd go a mile north and meet my father at my grandfather's place. Then it was just a mile and they'd walk home together. And they did that every day for, I don't know how long, 2 or 3 weeks. But we didn't lose any, right in that territory, we didn't lose anybody, but north of us, oh, there was a lot of them died. There was one family over at Laverne, they had 3 children die at the same time, same day, and they all 3 were buried in the same grave. And the doctors had quite a time getting around. They couldn't, they would, well, old Dr. Martley had a horse and buggy, and he hired a man to go with him. And he never did go back to Follett. He'd just go from one house to another house. And then finally, when he got so tired, he would stop at the house, at the last house where he just felt like he couldn't go on. And he would maybe lay down on the floor in front of a wood-burning stove and sleep 2 or 3 hours. And the man with him would sleep too. And then they'd get in the buggy and go on to the next house. And that's the way that we, and I don't understand why, and I don't know whether the doctors did, but most pregnant women died from the flu. And nobody seems to know why a pregnancy would cause a woman to die with the flu. But just practically every woman that was expecting a baby died at that time.
How long did that flu last?
Well, we had it in 1918, and I think it continued through 1919, perhaps. I've heard it argued that the flu was worse in 18 than it was in 19, but I really don't know.
Any other epidemics in those years around here?
There was an epidemic of polio, when I was a year old. And I had the polio. The other children didn't take it. But there were just a lot of children in our neighborhood and out of ways that we'd hear about had the polio. The Sumters over at Laverne, 2 of their girls had it. And the Moores, a boy and a girl had it there. And the Roaches, they had a child that had it. And the Hoax had a child that had it. Now, I was a year old when I had it, and I had it in a very light form. I was cranky, and I cried all summer long, and Mother would carry me and do her work. She'd lay me down, and I would start crying, and she couldn't stand to hear me cry, and she thought I had the summer complaint. In that era of history, they expected the children to have the summer complaint their second summer, and it was my second summer. So they thought it was just summer complaint. And that fall, when the weather got cool and I was feeling better, I'd get up to walk and hang on to a chair, and that ankle would turn, and I'd sit down. Finally, Daddy whittled out 2 splints, and they put cotton around them, and they'd put that on my foot. And that's the way I learned to walk. And they took me to Dr. Markley, and he told folks then I had polio. Well, Mother says she's not had a bad sick spell. Says she's been cranky all summer, hard to get along with, but says she's not had a bad sick spell. And he says, well, just the same, it's polio. But they couldn't hardly believe that. But as time went on, every doctor the folks would hear about, they'd take me to. And one doctor told the folks that when I got to be 17 years old, my back would be in a letter S. Well, the Sumter girls, their backs did get to be in a letter S. But they had a real bad sick spell, both of them. They thought they were going to lose them. Well, anyway, when I was about 9 or 10, the folks heard of a lady doctor in Gage, Oklahoma. And I can remember that trip so well because it was quite an adventure, you know. Daddy borrowed my uncle's buggy and his team because he was a single man and he had pretty horses, you know, and they were horses that was used to being driven to the buggy instead of Daddy's old work horses, you know. And so we headed for Gage. And this lady doctor, Dr. Kerr, I never will forget her, she explained to Mother just what happened. I had polio, that the inside muscles of my leg was all right. It didn't affect that. But the outside muscles, see the muscles that works your foot and this way, was paralyzed. That caused the foot to draw, see. And she said what they'll have to do is to go in there and put that joint back into the socket in my foot, run a bone drill up through the bottom and let that grow solid. And then I can walk with my foot flat on the floor. Well, Mother says, can you do that? Oh no, she says, you'll have to go to Chicago to have that done. And so the folks, they didn't have the money to take me to Chicago anyway, but they couldn't stand to see my foot operated on. And it went on, and finally, when I was teaching school, I could see that my foot was getting worse. And I never could teach sitting down. I had to stand up. And at night I'd go home, my foot would be swollen and it just hurt me so badly. So I saved my money. I taught school 2 years. I saved my money. And I went to Halstead, Kansas. Dr. Hirschler came in and looked at my foot and he says, well, I can't guarantee you 100% cure. But he says, I can guarantee you an 80%. And you can walk with your foot flat on the floor. I said, I'm ready for 80%. I didn't even ask Mother and Daddy. I just told him to go ahead with it. And that operation was a success. It changed my whole outlook on life. Because there was certain things that I had vowed I wouldn't do. And until I did get my foot operated on. And one of them was to get married. Because I didn't want to be a burden to anybody. And after that foot was fixed and I could walk on it and run like other people and I could play basketball and anything else I wanted to do, then I was teaching at North Ivanhoe and Bryce happened to be the clerk of that district. And so we got to liking each other and we got married.
When did you get married?
March the 15th, 1930.
Where'd you meet?
Well, where did we meet? I was going to school in Beaver, and the teachers at all, see, there was a school every 6 miles, every 4 miles there would be a school, country school. My sister was teaching, and there was about 4 districts. Those 4 teachers, they decided they might as well have some fun, and they were starting putting on plays, 3-hour plays. And so Bryce was living in, he was batching there. He bought 160 acres, and I had never met him. My folks had met him, and Francis knew him, but I had never met him yet. And so I came home, my uncle came and got me to come home to see this play that they were putting on. And here was a young man stepped out on that stage I had never seen before. And I said, well, who is that? And so after the play was over, I told Francis, I said, I want to meet that young man. Can you introduce me to him? Yes, she can. But she never did. And Willis Clayton, a young man that was in the play that I knew real well, I said, I want to meet that man. Well, I'll introduce you to him. Nobody introduced me to him. So the next time I saw him was quite a bit later than that, and it was at a party. See, in those days we had to plan our own entertainment, and every Saturday night we had a play party where you play skip-to-maloo and all of those games, you know, which in reality is square dancing, only to singing instead of music. And in the songs, you made your own calls. See, the songs was such that the calls was in the songs. And so he was in the ring playing games, and I was too. And when he got to be my partner, why, he says, I don't believe I've met you. And I said, no, and I haven't met you. So we told each other our names, and he took me home from the party that night. And from then on, we probably dated for, I don't know, 7 or 8 months. And then we got married. Now, you know my romantic life, don't you?
I'd like some more information on play party.
On play parties?
Yeah, why didn't you have dances?
My folks wouldn't allow us girls to go to dances, and that was the sentiment about everybody there. Now, there was a platform dance, about 4 or 5 miles north and west of where we lived. But there was drinking, and my father just wouldn't let us girls go to it. The boys went. And there would be fights, you know what goes on. And that left the rest of the young people without any kind of form of entertainment. So we got to having these play parties. And the parents would go too. Everybody would go. It was a place of entertainment for
Where were
everybody.
they held?
At the various homes, and it was usually in the summertime, and we'd play out in the yard. They always liked to come to our yard because we had a big yard and it was grassed over. And that way, when you do-si-do, you wouldn't be kicking up any dust. And then, just first one family, then another, you know. And
You had music at play party?
no, we sang.
You sang.
There was a young man went back to Kentucky to visit some folks, and they were having these play parties back there. And he was a good singer, and he learned these songs for the different. Well, really, we square danced was what we done. But the changes was made in these songs. And so when he came home, he really was the one that organized the first play party. And he would sing these songs, you know. And some of the, when they first started out, Mother and Daddy would get out and be in the group too, you know, and they would square dance. Us younger kids, we'd talk about our square dances, but not before the parents, because they were unpriced.
How did the Depression affect the farm?
Badly. Or it did us, and it did everybody around us, but we were all alike. We were in the same boat. I know that Bryce always worked with the county agent, and that helped us a lot. And they taught us how to use things at an advantage, you see, and plan our. Now, I remember the county agent. He became quite a friend to us, and close friend to Bryce.
Just like. What about the county agent?
And the county agent would visit our farm and teach us how to do things, you know, that would be to our advantage. And I remember he brought us out some tomato seeds that they wanted to just try out, you know. They were trying out these different what do I want to say? The experiment stations would put out different lines of different things that they'd want to try out in different areas, you know. And I remember the county agent brought us out some tomato seed, and they called it the porter tomato. They were a small tomato, but they could stand the drought. And while we were having this depression, we were having a drought, at the same time. And that's what made it bad. And so anything like that would come out, he would always see that we got the advantage of some of these things. So I remember I planted the porter tomato. And at that time, our well, which was about 180 feet deep, was in the backyard. And Bryce plowed up the ground just west of the well where I could irrigate it, And we didn't have the trees around the place at that time. So we planted, we planted some hay on the south and west of this plot of ground to make a windbreak, because we were having high winds and dirt was blowing, and that made a windbreak for my garden, and then I could irrigate it from this well. And I planted his tomato seeds he brought out, and oh, did I raise tomatoes. But and I canned tomatoes and I gave tomatoes away, and that's the way the farmers did. If they had more than what they could use, come and help yourself, And with the people helping each other, why, nobody went hungry, but I raised chickens, and at one time we got into the business of selling hatching eggs. That way we could make a little money. And the feed that came in, they got to putting the chicken feed in pretty floured sacks, and the women was real happy when we'd go to the produce store to get our chicken feed. We would pick out 2 or 3 sacks just alike to get that particular design, and we'd make dresses for ourselves out of those sacks. And for me to tell my grandchildren that, they can't believe it.
That was a cotton?
Yes, it was cotton. And while it wasn't as smooth as percale or calico, but it was fairly smooth. And it made pretty dresses for you could wear every day. I always had 1 or 2 what I called my nice dresses that I'd put on when I'd go to town. But around home there, they made nice little dresses to work in and so on. And there was so many things like that that we worked at together. And we milked cows and carried the milk to the house and separated it and put the cream. I had on the utility porch, Bryson built me in some shelves, and that's where I kept my cream. It was cool out there. And then we'd carry the milk down and feed the bucket calves. We'd take the calves off the cows so that we could get more milk, you see, and then feed them the skim milk, which was just as good for the calves, because all the nutrient in the milk was still there, except the fat. And then Bryce always had fodder or feed, some kind to feed for the calves to have too. The calves did well, and then he raised, he built a hog pen, and he raised purebred Hampshires, I believe, a red hog.
Duos.
Might have been. But we've laughed about it often. Whenever he'd have a new litter of pigs, he would let me pick out 1 pig, and that pig would be sold, and that would be money for me to use in whatever way I wanted to. And he had taught me what a good pig, the good qualities of a pig, what to look for in a good pig. And he says, I'm going to have to quit that. He says, you're picking the best pig out of the litter. And The dirt storms was terrible.
I was going to ask about the dirt storms.
One day it would blow from the north, and the driveway was north of. See, our house didn't sit on the section line. It was off to the south a little ways. And our driveway was straight north and south. And the dirt would come down that driveway from the north so badly at times that you couldn't see the barn off to the east. And the next day, it would come from the south. And we kept our windows, doors chinked, except one. And whenever I would cook a meal, I would hurry because the air would be full of dust. You couldn't keep that dust out of the house. And I cooked everything that had a cover on. Then the dishes I'd get out of the cabinet, I'd wipe them off. They would come to the kettles on the stove and dip out what food they wanted on their plates and hurriedly go back to the table and sit down and eat. And then I'd wash the dishes immediately, put them back in the cabinet, and the next meal they would be a layer of dust on the dishes. And that was day after day after day. The man that owned the field just south of our pasture, half mile south of us, he didn't try to stop it. That field blew over on our pasture halfway over and covered up the dust, or covered up the grass. And there was nothing grew in our pasture but just weeds when it did start, you know. And that was right in line with our house. And Bryce would mention it about it, and he said, well, there's no use to do anything about it. It says the wind will come back from the north next day and blow it the other way. But Bryce would take his horses and go out, and he would plow furrows, you know, about every 20 feet apart to stop it. His fields blew, but not nearly as badly as our neighbors would.
So if you plow a furrow, that would help hold the dirt?
Yes, that would help hold the dirt. And he would be out there, and the dirt would be blowing so badly that the horse's eyes would just be matted with dirt. And he'd come in with, well, he didn't even look like a white man. And his hair and his hat would just be covered in his face.
Tell me about Black Sunday.
Black Sunday started as a beautiful day, and I was silly enough to think that maybe the dirt storms was over. So Bryce made well, first off, he woke me up that morning to go out to look at the most beautiful sunrise you ever saw. And I was grumpy, and he woke me up before sunup, and it was Sunday morning, and we usually slept late on Sunday morning. But I got up and went out, and there were the most beautiful streaks going up from the horizon, way up in the sky. Just all colors, just like the northern lights. And when he saw them, he said they were deeper colored than when I got out there. He says, you haven't seen them at their best, but they were beautiful when I saw them. And I stood out there just in awe because it was one of the most beautiful sights, and I wondered how many of the neighbors would be up and would see that. But they were all like us, they always slept late on Sunday morning. But anyway, I said, Bryce, maybe that's an omen now that our dust storms are over and it's going to rain. So he made a deal with me. If I'd go down and help him milk the cows, he would help me clean house. And the dirt had blown terrible for a week. 3 or 4 days anyway, before Black Sunday. And the house was terrible, and you'd sleep and you'd wake up next morning and the dirt, your pillow would just be covered with dirt. Of course your hair was too, you know. And that'd be the only white you could see on the pillows where your head had laid. And I took all my curtains down, put them away, and you can imagine how a house would look like that. But anyway, I helped him milk cows. He came in and he brought a half a bushel, and I had a bucket, big bucket, and we took all the chinking out of the windows, and we raised the windows and we swept those out. And you would sweep that dirt up, and I had a coal shovel, a stove. You know, you shovel coal into a stove. It's a little shovel about 6 inches wide with a handle on it. He brought in the scoop shovel, and we'd sweep that up, and he got his half bushel of dirt out of, well, let's see, 3 bedrooms, a living room, a dining room, kitchen, bathroom, and the utility porch. He got his half bushel full, and mine was about half full of dirt out of that house. And then when we got the dirt all out, I mopped the bedroom, the 2 bedrooms that we used, and the kitchen. And he kept us saying, it's foolish to do all this. Tomorrow the dirt's going to come again. But the house looked so nice, and I was so proud of it. And that was one day we could eat a meal without seemingly a bit of dust in the air. And I said, let's go for a walk. And, well, Bryce didn't want to go. So we were sitting on the back steps and looked to the west, and there come a dirt a-rolling. There was jackrabbits, there were birds, thistles a-blowing and a-rolling. We all run to the corner of the house, and there was those clouds just rolling in, you know. They didn't seem to be just coming, they were rolling, you know. And here'd be a big cloud rolling, right next to it would be another big cloud rolling. It wasn't solid across, it just seemed to be a cloud here and a cloud here and up high, you know. And he said, oh, you and John run in the house quick. I'll go turn the windmill off.
Is that your boy?
That was John, our boy. He was 4 that year, that April. And I took him by the hand, and before we could get into the house, I couldn't see him. And I remembered where a chair sat.
So you were not in the house when the storm hit?
No,
So you couldn't even see the house?
no. I got to the door, I couldn't see anything. I couldn't see John holding hold of his hand right there by me. And boy, did I hang on to that little hand. I wasn't about to let him get away from me. But I remembered where a chair sat. There was a certain chair in the kitchen, and I made for that. I took him on my lap. I couldn't see him. He couldn't see me. Every little bit he'd reach up and feel my face, you know, to see if I was still there, I guess. But he never made a sound. I didn't either. You couldn't see anything. Absolutely, it was as black as you. There was a window not too far there. I couldn't see that window. That window was just... And I got to thinking, well, what about Bryce? Could he find his way back to the house? He knew what direction to go in, you know, to the house. but he missed the door. And when he hit the side of the house, he got the feeling, the window, and he knew how to get into the house. So he come in. I didn't hear him. I didn't see him. And he was right beside me, and he said, "Where are you?" And he was standing right beside me, and I couldn't see him. He couldn't see me. I reached out and touched him. And so he kind of knelt down there by the chair. He said, "Are you all right?" And I said, "Yes." And he says, "How's John?" And I said, "John, are you all right?" "Yes," he said. And pretty soon Bryce got to coughing and choking, and he made his way to the stove, and we had a Perfection oil stove, burnt kerosene. He found the matches and he lit that. He lit the lamp, coal oil burning lamp. You couldn't see it. I couldn't see it from where I was sitting, but he said he could just see a tiny, tiny light. He was closer to it by that time than I was. And he managed to get some water in a pan, put it on the stove, and he leaned over right over that and breathed that steam. And that got him to where he could breathe.
What were you thinking at this time during this storm?
Really, I think my mind was blank. I don't know what I was thinking. I wasn't afraid. Now, a lot of them, people you talk to, they thought the world was coming to an end. But I wasn't afraid. But I never have been afraid. I've always had a faith that God was with me, that he would take care of me, and as long as he was with me, I didn't need to be afraid. I had a good friend, and he would look out for me. But I remember how tightly I hugged my little boy. I remember that to me, because I didn't want him to get off my lap, you know. Then when it began to get light, we could see the outline of the window first, but it was quite a while before we could see the barns off to the side.
How long did that last, storm?
I really can't say positively. It seemed like hours, that total blackness. But I doubt if it lasted more than 20 or 30 minutes, at the most.
You mentioned the lightning.
Down on the home place, when I was a child growing up, my daddy was always afraid of storms and lightning. And everywhere he built a home, he saw there was a cellar there. And if it come up a cloud, looked like it was going to be bad. And I don't know what made him afraid of storms. It might have been he went through a storm when he was a child that made him so afraid of storms, but he was. He'd always built this cellar. And I was just a baby, and of course I don't remember it, but I've heard the folks tell it so much that it seems like that I can remember living through it. This cloud came up quickly. And old Grandpa Nyhart was kind of grumpy old fellow. And but he wasn't a well man. He was sickly, and that could have made him grumpy. But anyway, his kids was all afraid of him. And Fred was about 16, 17 years old, their son. And they hauled water from my father's well, because they hadn't dug a well yet. And so Fred came up there, Mr. Nyhart sent him up there with 2 barrels on a sled and 2 horses to come up to our place to get water when this storm came up. Well, at that time, this 40 acres across the the section line that Daddy filed on, he had a barn there, and his horse lots and his cattle lots was all on that side. And his barn just was big enough to hold 2 horses. It was just a small barn. And so he went down and turned his horses out and put Fred's horses in the barn in case it came a hailstorm or something. Daddy'd rather that his horses would take it than for Mr. Nyhart's. And Daddy's horses, one went on the north side of the barn and one on the south side of the barn. And Fred came in the house. Well, Daddy decided we'd better all go to the cellar. And so they went to the cellar. Well, Daddy would stand at the door and look out every little bit, and he decided the storm was over. And we all came out, went to the house. Before they could get in the house, there was a big, big clap of thunder and lightning. And Daddy said, well, I think we better go back to the cellar. And so they all headed back to the cellar. When he opened that cellar door, sulfur smokes and fumes and things came up. Oh, my father said, the cellar's been struck by lightning. So they head back to the house. And in those days, the doorknobs and was just kind of a square concern with what they called a night latch on it, night lock. And then the door handle was in the middle of it. Well, that lightning had locked every one of those night locks. And no key. I don't know whether they had keys to unlock them or not. But the main purpose of those, when you were inside the house, you wanted to go to bed and you wanted to lock your house, you'd put those night locks on. I'll bet your grandfather knows what I'm talking about. But every one of those had locked. Well, Daddy took screen off and opened the window and pushed my second brother in. And he unlocked the doors and we went in. They noticed that Daddy's horses was laying on the ground. Just as quickly as they thought it was safe, they went down and Daddy's horses was dead. Mr. Nyhart's horses were dead. And the only way that my father could figure that out, and he was quite an astrologer. He liked to study the stars. He loved that kind of work. He thinks that there was a lightning bolt coming down and it divided. And one hit the cellar when the other hit the barn. That's the way he had it figured out. And Fred was so worked up, he was afraid to go home and tell his father that the horses was dead. So my father went home with him. And he talked to Mr. Nyhart. And Mr. Nyhart just couldn't believe it. Well, he walks back up, which was about half a mile, and he looked at all of the horses. He went in and went down and looked at the cellar, and when the things cleared out in the cellar, Mother had a lot of home comfort magazines and Hearth and Home magazines, which were a popular magazine for the women in that day and age. And they were burnt. Mother had some canned goods sitting on the shelves that had the labels on. That was burnt off. The cellar was lined with 1x12s that had been in a house somewhere, and it had been papered. And the paper on that wood had been burned off. So I remember my mother and father talking later, 6 or 8 years. I was a kid, I don't know how old now, but I remember hearing them talking about that. And Mother said, well, you know, God had work for this family to do, or we'd have still been in that cellar. If we hadn't been, it wouldn't have been the one I was coming out of life. And another lightning story that I can remember this quite well because I was one of the participants in it. Mother and Francis was in the big house shutting the windows, and we had what they call a summer kitchen. And it was built a few feet from the other house. That kept the heat of the cooking and the canning and everything went on in there, you know, away from the other house and kept it cooler. And that was the way they built houses and homes in Missouri where Mother and Daddy was raised. Well, Daddy and I were standing in the door of this summer kitchen. And my father always had lightning rods on the houses. And we saw a big ball of fire come down the wire from the lightning rod, roll down that wire and disappear in the ground. And I thought I was burning up. My hands were on fire. My feet was on fire. And Mother come running out of the big house screaming, what's that? And she looked at Daddy and, are you all right? And we neither one could speak. We just stood there like zombies. We couldn't talk. And I was just burning all over, and he was too. And I don't remember how long that sensation lasted, but quite a little while, and we finally got all right. We could talk. I remember my father saying, well, I'm glad since it had to happen that you saw it, because says you'll probably never see a sight like that again. And I haven't. Now, when we were running the grade A dairy business, we had to have lightning rods put on the dairy barn. That was a must. And the young man that was selling us our lightning rods came there, and I told him that story. Well, first off, he got telling about the electric current comes up out of the ground and meets the electric current in the air, and that is what makes the thunder. And he says, you've never seen anybody that has seen lightning come down and hit the ground? And I says, yes, I have. And I told him that story. Well, he says, you're the first one that I've ever talked to that has seen such a thing. And he didn't believe me. That's shut up.
Okay, thank you.